Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, thank you for having us. My name is Ben Owens, and
I'm Noah Yang. Nice to meet you.
today we're presenting on LGBTQ workers' perceptions of union support in Windsor and Sudbury, Ontario. So briefly, this is the research team. We were working as a part of a broader work and inclusion project run out of McMaster University by Dr. Mills. We'll be presenting more on this shortly. And this was, just some of the folks that we worked with through this project. Just to sort of introduce the topic, previous research has demonstrated a range of negative workplace experiences among LGBTQ workers. And to cope with negative experiences at work, literature on LGBTQ workplace experiences has often emphasized the role of internal and individualized strategies. This includes managing the disclosure of identities and avoiding homophobic situations. Research has also demonstrated external strategies associated with sort of mitigating negative workplace experiences. And some of these include reactive strategies associated with the employer, which includes reaching out to human resources or management, as well as proactive strategies such as creating positive relationships with coworkers. As well, employers have increasingly begun to institute proactive policies at work. This is particularly at larger white-collar workplaces, and these include, the implementation of zero tolerance policies for discrimination and LGBT employee networks. But importantly, the majority of internal and external strategies for addressing workplace discrimination place the onus on LGBTQ+ workers and absolve employers of responsibility. As well, the proactive strategies implemented by employers have been criticized for being superficial and for their underlying economic rationales that are sort of premised on generating positive public perception, as well as increasing productivity and employee retention. So to turn to the role of unions in addressing workplace environments, there is a limited literature on union supports. So unions in Canada, particularly since the 1990s, have been instrumental in achieving the codification of LGBTQ+ rights and protections, both at work and in society more broadly. And this has occurred through collective bargaining, grievance arbitration, and supporting legal challenges and social movements. And in the years since, unions have implemented a variety of structural, material, and symbolic supports to improve LGBTQ+ representation and advocacy. These include non-discrimination policies, employee networks and caucuses, and trainings for members. Now, there's a small body of research on LGBT workers' perceptions of their unions, and this demonstrates how these supports can be inconsistent. So despite these progressive policies implemented by national and provincial bodies, qualitative research with LGBTQ workers has demonstrated a tension between parent unions and some local cultures, particularly when members express discriminatory sentiments and fail to support initiatives at the local level. So there are some important gaps in this literature that we are trying to address. Namely, there's a small body of literature on workers' perceptions of union support, and we want to build on that. But additionally, there's no work yet on the Canadian context, nor on smaller cities. And this is really important given Canada's history and current role of social unionism, as well as the sort of distinct cultures that can take place in some smaller and deindustrializing cities. Oh, and speaking quickly to the methodology, which Dr. Mills will be expanding on in her presentation, this is part of the broader Work and Inclusion project, which was a mixed methods project drawing on survey and interview data with workers in Windsor and Sudbury. And we are drawing on a subset of the qualitative interviews that were collected in 2019 with 28 unionized participants.
Our qualitative sample size is pretty varied in terms of age, sexual orientation, as well as gender. In terms of age, we have a pretty even split between 20 to 30-year-olds, 31 to 40-year-olds, and 41 to 50-year-olds. And with the last two groups, 51 to 70-year-olds make up about the final quarter. In terms of sexual orientation, once again, we have a pretty even split between gay, lesbian, bisexual participants, but we also have representatives from who are asexual or queer. In terms of gender, we mostly have cisgender and non-binary and two-spirit individuals. However, we do have 4 participants who are transgender. Also, in terms of like the types of occupations that people are from, it is mostly blue-collar workers, workers from the service industry, as well as people from the educational system. And in terms of the types of unions that people are from, it's usually from public sector unions as well as trade unions. So 3 themes were developed during the data analysis process. And the first theme that we found was signs of union support for LGBT workers. And this can look like positive representation, opportunities to connect with other LGBT workers, as well as protection from discrimination. So in terms of positive representation, this took the form of acknowledging LGBT presence, monetary contributions, inclusion in just resources, as well as public recognition. So one example was when LGBT workers, when they see resources on equity and being LGBT, it helps the workers feel included and supported by their unions, even when the information itself may have limited use. So one Windsor worker, part of the private sector, said they had pamphlets on it. I forget what the title was, but how to come out in the workplace as trans, and one was how to be an ally to a trans person, specifically for transgender people, which I found really interesting. Like, whoa. But I didn't like the way they represented it. They suggested that we write a letter saying this is what is happening and hand it out to people. Participants also highlighted the importance of connecting with LGBT colleagues. One example was when a public sector union loco's involvement at Pride helped a worker feel connected and find a sense of community. So in this quote, they said, "Our union has a booth at the Pride Parade. There is one worker in my department in particular that is constantly like, he might as well be a ray of sunshine. He is great, and he's been around me a lot. And I think that's because he saw me at Pride." So this sense of connection to your colleagues is particularly important in smaller and more conservative cities, because in cities like that, people are less likely and less comfortable to come out at their workplace, which further contribute to a sense of alienation. So the union support of queer identities not only provide a sense of workplace safety and comfort, but also provide an avenue for workers to turn to when they do face discrimination. So one example was when a casino worker really noticed this positive presence from their public sector union. And they said, if there were ever any issues with another employee, it was dealt with immediately because they have an office on site at the casino where they actually have the union stewards in office, and there's someone there all hours of the day. So they were just great about being available and present for our folks. However, just by having this place for workers to turn to doesn't solve all of the problems. For example, covert discrimination can be very hard to pinpoint and even harder to report. And when anonymity is not fully guaranteed, workers may fear repercussions at even just reporting such a complaint. Theme 2 was about inconsistent support for LGBT workers. And just like Ben mentioned in the introduction, there is that inconsistency between national and provincial as well as local levels. This inconsistency can also exist at the same level as well, even between different locals and members of the same local. Several participants noted that they don't feel supported by their local union, even when they feel like that the union at the national or provincial level is demonstrating a lot of support. A Sudbury participant shared the above quote, "I do not get support from my local union. It's an open union on the provincial level, but at the local level, it is not very supportive." LGBT workers are especially vulnerable in cities with more conservative cultures once again, because even though the union at the provincial or the national level, they might have great visions and have great initiatives, and they might be able to carry this out in, they might be able to carry it out in bigger cities and cities with more liberal ideologies. But in smaller cities, what the union local can do is still restricted by the culture of the city. So the inconsistency between different locals can leave some workers falling through the cracks. A lack of participation from union locals in LGBT events can make the workers feel like a sense of distrust towards the overall ability of the union in representing their interests. A Windsor worker, part of a public sector union, said, "The other local has a booth and they're in the parade. My local does nothing. It's like it doesn't exist." Yeah, they're pretty weak like that, weak in their support and mindset. Theme 3 was about feeling unsupported by unions, and it took the form of an absence of explicit support as well as covert discrimination. So both of those combined contributes to a sense of union disconnect and employees preferring employer support. Several participants couldn't really find explicit rules, regulations, or resources saying that they do support LGBT workers from the union. And a worker from Windsor said there were two, actually I skipped one. Yeah, and a worker from Windsor said, to be honest, I've looked a little bit, but I get very frustrated when I can't find the information. It's like the Army's don't ask, don't tell type of thing. So there's nothing explicitly saying you're safe, we'll help you. Union members' personal beliefs can also impact how workers feel towards a union. So even if there's no discriminatory statements, union members' discomfort around the idea of queerness and their actions even outside professional settings can still alienate LGBT workers. So union leaders' personal beliefs can also interfere with the democratic process of electing for union stewards. A Sudbury participant, part of a private sector union, said, there were two people in the shop, myself and another guy who were signed up to be stewards. I ended up with the most votes and the union hall chose to give it to him. They said, we just think he's better suited for the position. Union disconnect. So workers can feel disconnected from their unions if the union leadership does not take on an active role. This leads to the workers not really knowing what the union does and not really being able to ask them for help when they do need it. Some workers and interviewees that we had said that they weren't sure which unions they're in and they don't really recall any interactions with them outside of paying for union dues. One retirement home worker said, I know the retirement home was unionized, but only through a food workers union, so it wasn't very effective at not having me administer fentanyl anymore. I would pay my union dues and like nothing really came out of it. So this really highlights the union's responsibility and role in initiating this kind of relationship and really reaching out to connect with their workers. So this lack of strong union support in conjunction with decent employer support leads to a minimized need for workers to reach out to the union and further contributing to the sense of union disconnect. So a university teaching assistant said, I can't say that my union would be the first thing that would come to my mind as somewhere to go. It's a bit of an elusive thing that exists that I know that I'm part of, but I'm not involved in. So we tend to notice that white collar workers with more ideal work environments tend to have these kind of sentiments as well.
Okay, so in conclusion, the findings from our study demonstrate a few things. One is the importance of symbolic supports that, while not sufficient in isolation by any means, participants in our study highlighted how symbolic demonstrations of support for the LGBTQ+ community went beyond superficiality and actually helped them to feel included and represented by their union. Symbolism can signal safety, it can promote comfort, and it can encourage workers to come forward when they experience discrimination at work. And in so doing kind of translates into more material supports if workers are more engaged and represented by their union. Despite symbolic displays by some of the unions that represented participants in our study, primarily from national and provincial levels of the union, workers continued to feel unsupported by their unions, and this highlights persistent discrepancies in union support across these different levels. In some cases, inconsistencies were regional, demonstrating difficulties associated with translating national and provincial policies to the local context. And in others, negative experiences with members could negate feelings of safety and initiatives at the local level. Finally, our findings speak to a broader disconnect in the labor movement between LGBTQ workers and their unions. A lack of LGBTQ+ supports compounded participants' feelings of distance from their union and a lack of knowledge about union processes. This dynamic emphasizes the importance of unions' leadership on LGBTQ+ issues and the need to actively build relationships and connections with LGBTQ+ workers. We also, based on these findings, have generated some recommendations for unions for how to better connect and build solidarities with LGBT members. Speaking first to the importance of symbolism, as well as to developing a deep awareness of issues related to LGBT work experiences, unions need to show up. And this includes being present at Pride events, being more supportive of openly gay workers and comfortable around notions of queerness, being more familiar with AIDS and HIV issues is something that was raised by participants, as well as embracing equity and understanding how intersectionality plays into workplace experiences. What is more, an attention to language was a second important finding that arose in our interviews with workers. And this includes both avoiding exclusive language, which can range from discriminatory conversations to language such as one participant mentioned, brothers and sisters, as opposed to also including siblings, that can play into binary notions of gender, and ensuring that language in general is more inclusive and respects workers' gender and sexual identities. And finally, through the creation of LGBT networks and caucuses and events, unions can facilitate relationships between LGBT workers to reduce isolation and amplify their voices within the union.